The woman came to report a case, saying she had lost a bracelet. As she spoke, she pulled up her own recollection, showing that at the time she had indeed placed the bracelet on the sink. The detective accessed the cleaner's cloud database and pulled up her perspective. The woman wasn't wrong, and the case was easily solved. In the future world, people have VR chips implanted in their eyes from birth. When they see a watch they like, they can instantly activate augmented reality to see how it would look on them. As for payment, it's even more convenient than QR codes. Two people just have to look at each other, and the transaction is complete. Of course, such advanced technology also has its downsides. Walking down the street, everyone's information, including their name, age, profession, and even potential criminal tendencies, is visible to passers-by. Even dogs have no privacy, let alone people. With this godlike technology, solving cases is almost effortless for the police. With a god's eye view, they can check anyone's memories at will. However, on this day, a bizarre murder occurred. As usual, the detective pulled up the victim's final moments, expecting to see the killer's face. But suddenly, there was a signal disruption, and the view shifted from the victim to the killer. This meant that, in that moment, the victim couldn't see the killer, only themselves about to be murdered. Panicked, they frantically looked around. With a gunshot, the recording ended. It was clear that someone had hacked into the cloud system, disrupted the victim's VR chip before the murder, and altered their final moments. Similar murders started happening one after another, all with killers hacking into the victim's views, committing the crime without leaving any trace. This left the detective at a dead end. Then he suddenly remembered a girl. Just a few days earlier, he had bumped into her on the street and noticed that her displayed information showed as unknown error. The next day, when the detective tried to review that memory again, he discovered she had already been erased from the cloud. That night, 2 more people were killed. At the crime scene, the detective heard suspicious noises and chased the killer down to the subway station. At that moment, the stairs in front of him flickered, and the detective missed a step, tumbling down. Struggling to get up, he saw a subway car with its doors open. He quickly raised his gun, but the passengers inside seemed vacant, as if they hadn't noticed him. Something was wrong. His view had been hacked as well. The subway and passengers he was seeing didn't exist at all. Just then, the real subway roared past, slamming him to the ground. The detective realized the perpetrator possessed advanced hacking skills, able to bypass police permissions and easily hack into anyone's cloud, controlling their view. This person wasn't acting alone. They were part of a large, hidden group known as the Anonymous. Through the investigation, it became clear that all the victims shared one thing in common. Before their deaths, they had all hired the Anonymous to alter memories, hiding their illegal activities. But why were the Anonymous killing their clients? To solve the mystery, the detective decided to become bait himself. He devised a plan, disguising himself as a wealthy investment manager. By day, he earned money, and by night, he lived lavishly, just waiting for the big fish to bite. He arranged a meeting with someone he shouldn't have, and later regretted it. To completely erase the memory of the event, the man logged onto the dark web to search for a hacker. Soon, many people offered to take the job, but he rejected them all one by one. It turned out the man was actually a detective, and he was waiting for a big catch. Finally, the big fish took the bait. It was a young girl. The girl skillfully entered the man's visual feed, erased the memories he had specified, and thoughtfully replaced them with scenes of him being home alone. When the man tried to ask more questions, the girl became impatient. Without a word, she turned around and pulled out a gun. A gunshot rang out, and the girl disappeared without a trace. Luckily, the detective's colleague, who had been lying in wait next door, managed to track her proxy server. The police brought in an internal hacker to help reverse hack into the girl's visual feed. But her life seemed perfectly normal. All they saw was her assisting in another transaction, this time helping a fake art dealer erase the memory of buying counterfeit art, replacing it with fake footage of discovering an authentic piece. The police got nothing from the surveillance, and were about to give up when the art dealer turned up dead. His final moments were identical to those of the previous victims. With no other options, the man had to pretend to commit a crime again, seeking out the girl to help him alter his memories. This time, he used the opportunity to subtly probe into her background. However, something changed between them during this encounter. There was a subtle shift in their dynamic, a a tension that hadn't been there before. Good times are always fleeting. As the girl was erasing the record of that night, she unintentionally noticed a flicker in the man's memory feed. Something was off. This was a sign of tampering. She rewound the footage, checking it frame by frame, and sure enough, she spotted a guard. Switching to the guard's perspective, she saw the man approaching her. Above his head, in bold letters, it read, "Level 1 Detective." The girl immediately turned and left. At that moment, the man heard a gunshot. Rushing outside, he found his partner, the stocky one, lying in a pool of blood. Then the girl's phone call came through. The man was stunned, unable to believe that the girl could be the one who had killed his partner. But what he didn't anticipate was that the girl had hacked into his visual feed. Her revenge had begun. In an instant, the girl invaded the detective's perspective. The familiar sight of his home morphed into a street, and a burly man rushed at him, mercilessly beating him. This was a hallucination implanted by the hacker. Before the man could react, a fierce dog came charging at him. Even though he knew it was an illusion, he couldn't help but back away in fear. As if that wasn't enough, the very next day, as he stepped out of his room, the once calm corridor suddenly erupted in flames. In a panic, he fired several shots into the air. But as the flames vanished, he saw his neighbor standing timidly in the doorway. The highly tense detective slowly lowered his gun and walked over to the elevator, pressing the button. However, just as he was about to step inside, he remembered seeing the elevator arrive. Instead, he found himself staring into a bottomless elevator shaft, nearly losing his life. He decided it was safer to head to the police station. Driving to an intersection, he cautiously looked around to ensure no one was nearby before starting the car. But the reality of the situation was different. The detective collapsed on the side of the road, the series of events leaving him unable to trust his own eyes any longer. At that moment, worse news arrived. The neighbor who had been standing at the door earlier had died, shot by a stray bullet. The primary suspect was none other than the detective himself, as he had fired his weapon at that time. The detective was at a loss for words. He knew he had been framed by the hacker, but no one would believe him. As a result, the police department had placed him on temporary suspension and put him under house arrest, monitored 24 hours a day. Keeping a straight face, the detective lay down on his bed and closed his eyes, pretending to be asleep. As expected, the officer downstairs monitoring him saw nothing but darkness. Meanwhile, the detective maintained a steady breathing pattern, slowly getting up, keeping his eyes closed, and feeling his way along the wall as he made his way downstairs. By the time the officer realized what was happening, he had already been knocked out with a single punch. The detective arrived at the girl's residence, where she told him that she wasn't responsible for any of the deaths. Before he had left the apartment, his partner, the stocky one, had already been shot dead. To uncover the real killer, they set a trap. The detective returned to his apartment and suddenly saw the fireplace flicker, transforming into the familiar view of the murderer's perspective. He realized that he had been hacked at that moment. Then a gunshot rang out, and the detective was hit, collapsing to the ground. But he wasn't dead. At the same time, someone else had shot the killer in the knee, and that person was the girl. The detective finally saw the killer's face. It was the Cyrus from the police department, the very internal hacker who had been helping them solve cases. He was the one who had previously reverse-hacked into the girl's perspective. It turned out this hacker had set his sights on the girl long ago. He intended to team up with her to control the entire cloud system, so he killed everyone who had met her and framed the detective, ensuring that she would have to obey him indefinitely. At that moment, the detective fired his gun. The hacker grabbed the girl and ran, prompting the detective to chase after them. But this time, he didn't trust his eyes. Instead, he faced the wall, relying solely on his hearing, and fired several shots, ultimately taking down the killer. After the girl deleted her cloud records, she vanished without a trace. The case was solved, and the detective regained his position, but he never revealed the girl's identity to anyone. In such a transparent future world, it had become an era of surveillance. The complete lack of privacy was terrifying. Just as the girl had said, "All right, that's all for today's story. If you have any other stories you'd like to hear, feel free to leave a comment below. I'm waiting, and I'll see you in the next episode."